Welcome into the Miami Dolphins Dynasty review, looking at what changed with the Dolphins in terms of Dynasty over the 2023 season and beyond. Of course, we look at from a Superflex point of view because that's how all Dynasty leagues should be, Superflex. But, we'll throw in some single one quarterback stuff every now and then. Brian, the Dolphins, good season, disappointing? Like, you want more from this team? Kind of a interesting team.
Um, I don't know if me personally, I want more, but I don't know. I thought they were really good, like fantasy wise, like they were very productive and everything like that. Which is kind of funny because I think like Tua was the biggest loser, given like for the whole team. I mean, so yeah, we'll get into it, but yeah, I thought they did pretty well, and I think things can swing the other way for him for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting team. They're in an interesting spot. They went 11-6. Of course, they just kind of sucked at the end of the year. Like they had a chance to lock up the division against Buffalo, and they didn't. And then they went to Kansas City, and it was super cold, and they just looked like they didn't want to be there. Only scored like 7 or 10 points or something. Obviously we had the 70-20, but whenever they played good teams, I don't know if they really beat any good teams. I think there was one. Was it the Cowboys that they beat? I think there was one. Yeah, it was the Cowboys. They beat. That was like the only good team they beat all year long, I'd say. But obviously Mike McDaniel's there. Their cap space is terrible. It's the 30th worst or best, whatever you want to look at. But they're under $50 million in the hole. They only have 6 draft picks. They do have their first 2 picks, but then after that, they don't have one to the 5th round. So that hurts. They lost their defensive coordinator. Free agents, there's not a whole lot to talk about in terms of fantasy relevant guys. Really no one, to be honest. Bunch of receivers are free agents, but Cedric Wilson, Braxton Berrios, Chase Claypool, River Craycraft, these are guys that, weren't doing anything really for fantasy. So, we'll just jump right into it with Tua, who I kind of have a decent amount to say about him. He's ranked as QB 13 in Keep Trade Cut. He finished the year as QB 9, averaged 16.7 points per game, but he was not great, especially after their bye week. In week 10, you just kind of look at 4 games under 15 points in so 4 of 8 games under 15 points, which isn't great. No games in the 20s. So where are you at with Tua? Obviously, it's super flex, so he's obviously valuable. But do you think he's? I don't know. Like you look at the tier he's in on Keep Trade Cut, in there with Kyler, Lawrence, Purdy, Dak, Fields. Like, would you want Tua at the end of that? Do you want him at the beginning of that? Like, where would you put him in that tier?
It's kind of hard to say. Like, I think he kind of belongs right there, I guess I haven't really thought about like where he belongs in this tier. Like we've seen like good finishes from him, and I see him as, did he finish as QB 9 this year?
Yeah, QB 9 overall.
Yeah, and 15. He was even 15 last year when he missed 4 games. So, I think things can kind of swing back the other way for him. Obviously the Dolphins scored a ton of rushing touchdowns. Like Mostert had 18 and even Achane had 8. So if that kind of swings back the other way, I mean, Tua still threw for 29. So I think that could easily be 35 or something next year, and throwing for 4,600 yards. So I think it could definitely get worse, but I don't think it will, given like the skill position players. Like I just think their offense is just really good in general. Like, they have a lot of playmakers, and he doesn't really have to do a whole lot in order to because they are so fast and they get a lot of yards after catch. But we've seen some really nice like bomb throws to Tyreek. Like he knows his receivers really well. He knows how to hit them in stride and everything like that. So I like Tua still. Like I think he's fallen a little bit more than I would think, but when you look at the guys
Mhm.
above him, it's kind of hard to argue like, oh, he's definitely better than Kyler or Purdy, like I think Purdy's situation is better. Even though it's kind of hard to say when you have, Mostert, Achane, Tyreek, and Waddle. So
Mhm. Yeah, the QB9 finish is. You do have to mention if you look below, CJ Stroud averaged 2 more points per game than him. Lawrence, Russell Wilson, Matthew Stafford, Justin Herbert, Justin Fields, Kirk Cousins, and Kyler all averaged more points than. That's 8 quarterbacks that averaged more points than him. That obviously didn't finish the year, but they played enough to where I would, add that into that equation. So, QB9 sounds great, but he was not a difference maker in my opinion. 16.7 points per game is not a difference maker at the position. So I'm just a little worried about Tua, just simply because he is literally in maybe the best spot in the entire NFL, right? You have this amazing coach. You play in Miami. This guy's obviously an offensive genius, the coach, and they can put up 70 points. You're throwing the ball to Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, two of the better receivers in the NFL. It's like maybe the best spot in the entire NFL. And like that is baked into his rankings a little bit, right? So I'm always a little wary about stuff like that. Still think, I guess what I'm getting at is obviously in Superflex he's valuable, but if you play in any non like 12 team, if you play in like a 10 team league like we do in one of our leagues, or even less than that, I don't think he's that great. I think he's closer to like QB 15 than he is QB 9, I guess. So 12, 14 team leagues, Superflex, Tua is valuable, but I don't know. But you are right with the touchdown. What was it? I think it was 28 total for running backs, which is the most in the NFL. And yeah, if that even drops by 10, 8, and Tua gets all of those, or even if he gets 5 more, then we're looking at him a little bit differently for sure. He did lead the league in passing yards. So I don't know. I guess like if I can transition to someone in the same tier and pick up a piece, I'm doing it. If I can add a piece, like I think I mentioned it. I don't know if I mentioned it on that video, but I tried to trade Tua and essentially the 201, the 203 in a 10 team. Yeah, the 201 for Anthony Richardson. And, I think that's kind of a fair trade, depending on how you feel about Tua. And I'm usually on the opposite end of that. Like I want to pick up a piece and tear down, but I wanted to move up, so I don't know. It's he's interesting spot for sure. So one more thing, and I know they mentioned it recently, a couple weeks ago, that they want to sign him long term, but he was in the same draft class as Burrow and Herbert, and you haven't heard anything about long term contracts with Tua until a couple weeks ago. Burrow and Herbert, we were talking about it 2 years into their career. They obviously got paid last year. We heard nothing about Tua. I know a lot of it was like, can he stay healthy, concussions, all that stuff. So,
right.
Yeah,
and
something to know.
I think that's something that's kind of important to mention too, is the health, because that has been the concerns, especially after last year with those concussions and everything. And they kind of showed like, yeah, look, he can stay healthy. Like, I mean, well, he showed. Yeah, so that kind of got wiped away, but a little bit. He kind of stayed probably right around where he was to start the year, going into 2023, just because I don't know if you call it efficiency necessarily, but yeah, it just wasn't quite there for him. So yeah, I think that's kind of something we have to mention, because those were like the huge concerns why you were kind of able to buy Tua on a dip, basically, in the preseason of going into 23.
Yeah, no, for sure. The other quarterbacks I think need to be rostered. I think whoever the starting quarterback for this team is at any point is valuable. So, Mike White and even Skylar Thompson need to be rostered, in my opinion. I kind of liked Skylar Thompson. Sorry, he was interesting guy. Like I could see him easily being like Aiden O'Connell-esque, but obviously in a better offense and better situation. So, both those guys I think need to be rostered. They're one of the backup quarterbacks. Like, all right, it's more about the team than them, but you definitely want to roster those guys. Running backs are going to be interesting to talk about. Mostert, obviously a big surprise this year, finished as the RB2 or 3 on the year. Yeah, 2 overall and I think 3 in points per game. Did miss the championship game, week 17, which kind of sucks, but scored a bunch of touchdowns. What are you doing with Raheem Mostert at this point, who's 32 years old going into next year?
Yeah, it looks that way. I see him as 31 right now.
Yeah.
So
April was his birthday, so yeah.
Yeah, he's kind of a tricky one in Dynasty, right? Because he's really old. He's had health concerns basically like more or less like most of his career. And, we saw him stay healthy this past year. And I know you like to talk about the numbers as far as like, what was the percentage of his fantasy points from touchdowns? Because he only ran for 1,000 and he only caught, a little less than 200. So 1,200 total yards does not make you, it's kind of hard to be RB2 with 1,200 total yards, but 21 total touchdowns definitely helps, so that's got to be a huge percentage, right?
He had, give me 1 second. So 21 total touchdowns.
Yeah.
It's 126 points. He had 242 and half.
Close to 50% then.
Right now he had 255. So
250. Yeah.
Yeah. Divided by 255. So yeah, almost 50%, just under 50%.
That's crazy. Like that's not sustainable necessarily. But the hard part is about like, because the question was like, what do you do with him? And it's like, I don't know really what you can get for him necessarily. Yeah. Like you kind of need to ride it out. Like the time to sell him if you were trying to rebuild was last year, like while he was doing all this crazy stuff. But if you can, like, I think the move for him is if you want him off your team just to get some kind of value. The nice thing is like he didn't like drop a ton in value, like going into the, from where he was before the year. Like he only rose probably like quite a bit. So I think the move is to try and ask for, a 2025 pick instead of like looking at directly this next year. And I think that's a lot more digestible for people, or I think it would be anyways.
Yeah. Or tagging something along with him, like a pick or a player and Mostert to like upgrade somewhere younger. But yeah, sure. I agree. It's one of those situations where it's like, you're not going to get anything of value for him. And he could be a top 10 running back next year. So it's not like he's like done.
Yeah, easy.
He just had it in his year 32 season. Doesn't have a lot of, a big workload because he did miss just a ridiculous amount of games. So, he could be very good. Like, I wouldn't be shocked if we see Mostert with 15 touchdowns or something next year, like because of this offense.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised at that, but at the same time, I think it's much more likely he's closer to 15 to 20 as opposed to being top 8 even. But it could swing either way. It's just.
But you're not even going to get RB 15 to 20 value for him right now. Is the hard part? Yeah. So
right. Like the keep trade cut basically has him as like the last pick of the second round, and it's kind of like. Yeah, I think I'd rather just take the 2025 second if it was between those two, just like as the kind of like it can't get any worse than the 212. So it's kind of like, it could be the 206 or something like that. But even then, it seems like a little low. Like his in-season value, as long as he's healthy, it's probably going to be a little bit more. But I mean, you're never going to get a first for him. So. No. Like you said, I think the move is to try and package him with something and try and just upgrade. Like you could probably use him to move up, maybe like 6 to 8 spots in the second round of this year's draft. Like, I think that's probably pretty realistic. What do you think about that?
Yeah. Yeah. It's always tough to speculate, like stuff like
Right.
that. But no, I for sure like moving up and things like that. Especially if you think, the next guy's going to kind of take over, which I really don't know what to think about HN, who he is the RB6 overall, according to Keep Trade Cut. He finishes the RB24 last year, despite missing 6 games and essentially not playing in 2 other ones where he could technically play it. He got 2.5 points in those games, but he played 10% or less of the snaps. So essentially playing in 8 or missing 8 games, he was the RB24, which is kind of crazy. Obviously, when you get almost 50 points and 75 points in 2 weeks, it's going to help. Man, this is tough because I'm already hearing, obviously it's February 3rd. We're way far away from the 2023 season is not even over yet, but you're hearing, if you listen to fantasy podcast now, potential first round pick as HN next year in redraft,
Man.
And it's tough. It's like, again, we assume he's going to take over, but is he going to completely take over? I don't think that's how McDaniel wants to run his offense. I think in San Francisco, they always had multiple running backs until McCaffrey came. So if they view him in that light, but I don't know, where are you at with HN? Do you think he's going to be a first, second rounder in redraft next year? Do you think he deserves to be the RB6? Would you just kind of trade high on him right now? What are you doing?
Yeah, I think, okay. So I think he's overvalued as far as being the RB6, but yeah, you kind of summed him up pretty well as far as he was just super hyper efficient, right? He's averaging, 7.77 yards per carry, 800 yards on 100 carries. That's not going to necessarily that's not going to sustain itself, but the type of player that he is and the way that they use him kind of lends itself to that a little bit. I don't think he's going to, be cracking 7 yards per carry, year over year, but it's kind of he does have that big play potential. So it's where does he slot in, right? As far as running backs, Kyron's right below him, ETN's right below that, and it's I think I'd be okay trading HN for one of those guys. Well, him and Kyron are basically the same value, which I'd rather have Kyron, I think, just because I think he's going to hold up a little better, maybe. I don't know. It's kind of tough because they're kind of similar in the sense they're both 5'9", and they're and it's funny because Kyron, when we talked about him, it's he's really slow, he's a super slow guy, whereas HN is really, really fast, but I think their roles are going to be completely different given where the offenses that they're in. So yeah, I don't know, man. It's tough because I do think he's overvalued, but at the same time, if you could turn him into a high-end quarterback, or even a quarterback from the tier that we were just talking about, because that's what they're kind of Keep Trade Cut is basically saying that, if you could turn him into Justin Fields, do that,
Yeah, for sure. I just don't think it's gonna. Yeah, I don't think that's real in a super flex.
Yeah, I don't really think it is either, but it just depends on what's on that person's team, and obviously there's a lot of, Justin Fields is kind of well, what's going to happen to him, kind of a thing, and it's you kind of have to decide he's going to be a starter next year, no matter where he goes or if he stays put. So it's kind of one of those things. What do you do with HN?
Yeah. And then the concerns about him coming in were his size, 5'9", 188 pounds, 190 pounds. And we saw him get hurt in preseason and then multiple times during the season. So does that mean he can't stay healthy? I don't know. People are going to point to a guy named Chris Johnson, who was a beast in the early late 2000s, early 2010s. He had a 2,000-yard season in 2009. He was a small guy. He was 5'11", but he was 190, 195 pounds. I'm more worried about the weight than anything. So he was similar, under 200, which is not what we would see, especially back then from running backs. You want a guy who's 215, 220. That's changed a little bit, of course. But still, we see guys around or under 200 and we freak out. But people are going to point to him for Jahmyr Gibbs and for HN. So it is really tough. You mentioned the 7.77 yards per carry. So 7.8 yards per carry. The most in NFL history is 7. And that's by a quarterback, Michael Vick. So obviously it's not the same situation there because that's a lot of it's coming on scrambles. For a running back, the most is 5.4 in NFL history. So we're talking about over 2 yards less per carry. Just adding to the fact of what you're saying, like that efficiency is probably not gonna last, which I think most people understand. Yeah, he is really tough, man. Like he is really, because he's on the perfect offense as well. Like
yeah.
Mike McDaniel is he made his bread and butter by like being a run game coordinator type of guy. Like that's how he came up, was a running backs coach and like the run game coordinator for San Francisco, and then the offensive coordinator. But he likes to run the ball. He wants to run the ball. He's going to use multiple running backs as well. So I think it's in their best interest to do that.
Yeah, and the nice thing is he's not going to face a bunch of stacked boxes either because you have to account for Waddle and Tyreek, If anyone's getting the attention, it's Tyreek, Like Waddle's no slouch, so it's kind of like they're kind of a hard team to defend against to some extent if everyone's playing on their A game. But, yeah, I just kind of wonder, is he ever going to be a 200-plus carry guy? I guess another question is, does he need to be? We kind of saw that he doesn't in order to be startable for sure. But it's like maybe he's more like 150 carries. But, he'll make up for that a little bit in the receiving game. Basically a 17-game pace. I'm just doing math off my top of my head. It was basically 150 rushing attempts and about 40 catches. And given his efficiency, which will probably go down, but I don't think it'll completely crater either. I think that might be all you need for him, from him to be like, an RB, maybe like a middling RB2 with huge upside.
Yeah, if we just do some math here, so like Miami ran the ball 26 times per game, which was actually 19th most, but 26 times per game last year. Let's just say they get to like closer to 30, which would put them, we'll just stick at, even if we stick at 26, Mostert basically averaged a little over 13 carries a game. So that means there's 13 other carries essentially, right? That to another running back.
Yeah.
So, 13 over 17 is over 200. So I think it is possible. That's 220. You do 220 and five yards a carry, you're over 1,000 yards, So, he is one of those guys where, like, all he needs is 11, 12, and he is a top 10 running back or something.
Yeah.
So, it's going to be interesting to see. It is really hard to trade a guy like that, but it's also like I could very well see if he just a couple more injuries next year, injured in preseason, he's just going to start to plummet,
Yeah.
So tough for sure. I don't want to sell a guy and then he turns into Chris Johnson and rushes for 2,000 yards or something, like that's not a good feeling.
And another quick thing on him, and then we can move on, is like, you got to think about the price you paid for him too. Like he was drafted kind of in the middle of round 2, maybe at the closer to the beginning of round 2 in the rookie draft last year. So it's not like you have a ton invested in him either. If you're really that worried about him losing value, and like that's like your main concern, like then try and trade him, like upgrade based on what you paid for him. But I think because of like similar to like how an NFL team, if they draft, Isaiah Pacheco in the 7th round and they're like, oh, cool, like we just hit on this, or, Kyron Williams in the 5th, with the Rams, it's kind of like, you know, you kind of struck gold a little bit, and maybe you should just be happy with that and just ride it out and see what happens. And his value can definitely go down. Like, I don't think I think it's more likely his value goes down. He's not going up necessarily, you know, but there's not a whole lot of room to go up. So it's kind of easy to say he could lose value, and he most likely will, but I don't know. It just kind of depends on how valuable he is to your team.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, for sure. The rest of these guys, including receivers and tight ends, should be pretty easy to get through. You know, Jeff Wilson, he's under contract. This team's in cap hell. They don't have a lot of picks. I'd keep him. Just hold him for now because, you know, we see the value in Miami running backs. Kind of a sleeper-ish guy is Chris Brooks, in my opinion. Like, I would stash him right now. You know, just in case they do move on from Jeff Wilson or whatever, and Chris Brooks is their RB3. He was one of those guys, and I'm always intrigued by, you know, undrafted free agents or late round picks who, like, basically are stashed on the roster for the entire year, which is kind of what Chris Brooks was. He was on the IR there for a good part of the season, but he was on their roster. They didn't want to put him on practice squad. I think they may have once, but they were very wary of it, it seemed like, which means they liked him and didn't want anyone else to pick him up. So he's a guy that, again, if he's the RB3 for this team, there's some value there. If Mostert gets hurt, if Achane gets hurt, guys that are, you know, maybe injury prone. So definitely someone I would be stashing. Receivers, I mean, Tyreek's awesome. He's going to play. The only bad thing about Tyreek this year is that he failed you in the most important, in the playoffs, right? In the fantasy playoffs. So,
you can't hold that.
No. And, you know, so seems like he's going to play for 2 more seasons. He's a difference maker. You know, he can win you weeks. He can win you leagues. So I don't want to really spend too much time on him. And,
I kind of have something real quick to say because I'm just looking at his positional rank across basically the last 2 years, and what I'm kind of noticing an interesting pattern. So it was after because he's been on the Dolphins 2 years, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. I'm just seeing, like, in the off season, he seems to dip quite a bit. You know, like in December, he's wide receiver 5 kind of a thing. And then in the off season, around the draft and everything, he's dropping down to, like, this happened the last 2 years. Wide receiver 12, wide receiver 14, that kind of thing. And then obviously in December, again, he just, like, spikes again, you know?
I think part of that is, well, one, you had him going from Kansas City to Miami, and no one believed he was
right. But it happened again last year, though, too.
Well, then the last year, I think, was when he announced he's going to be retiring in 3, which is stupid, but that stuff affects it, you know? Like, it definitely does. So it might happen again, but I would definitely point to those 2 things because I'm pretty sure when he, you know, I'm trying to see if I can find when he announced that retirement, but you know, in 3 years. So in April he said that. So I don't know if that's kind of where the dip started or right around there, but
no, it kind of started like at the end of January the end of December into January, and then April was kind of when he was at his lowest, you know. And you can kind of see a little bit of a cliff there, but like, I don't know. It was kind of on a downward trend already. I'm not saying this is going to happen again, but I just think it's a good thing to bring up about, you know, older wide receivers, is that people start valuing them less in the off season because they're not playing and they're not producing at that moment, you know, and people kind of like, well, is he going to fall off kind of a thing? It's like, I think he's a decent. Like if you do see that dip again right now, he's wide receiver 9. I mean, he's already started to fall off in value. Honestly, like he went from 6 down to 9 just from December till now.
Yeah.
So if that
makes
slips
sense
in
for the orders, like you're saying.
Yeah. like I get it, I get why, but like I think, if he starts slipping into that wide receiver, 12 to 15 range, and you're like a true competitor, it's like maybe you should put out some offers for him, so if that manager doesn't want to be stuck holding the bag kind of a thing.
Yeah. And he is almost 30, so he'll be 30 this year, and that's kind of the number. You'll hear that number thrown around, so that's always going to affect him as well. And then Waddle, I still think is really good. I think he's a potential buy low. Like if you look at his numbers, they weren't that far off from what he was doing in 2022. He averaged about 7 less yards per game. So, he was going to fall short from his yardage total. He had 4 touchdowns in 14 games. So he was going to have 5 or 6 instead of 8. He was going to have more catches. He had 72, and that was only 3 less than 2022. And he missed 3 games. Dude was battling injuries all year long to start the year, and just all year he was battling injuries. And I do think this team became a little bit fixated on we need to get Tyreek Hill 2,000 yards. And that kind of affected him a little bit. So I still really like Jalen Waddle. I think he's a really good asset, good player. And I wouldn't, worry too much about him. It's kind of crazy that he had over 1,000 yards. I don't think you would expect that, I guess, or think from his season. So, and even fantasy wise, he was maybe 1.5 points per game less, which is significant, but I think he can get back to, being that top guy that he was in 2022.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. Let's say you're a true contender, and you have Tyreek Hill. You trade him straight up for Jalen Waddle? Because there's only one guy in between them, right?
Nah. No, I'll take the wide receiver overall 1 potential from Tyreek, even for another year over that. It's too much. Tyreek's too much of a difference maker,
Yeah.
So I know.
Yeah, I don't.
The dynasty part of it is get the young guy, but it's dude, if this guy can win you your league in even just one of the next 2 years, maybe 2, I'll take that every day.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely not too many guys like that, He's just done it way too many years in a row for us to discount it, So yeah, watch, keep an eye on him, both of these guys, especially if something happens to Tua and people start devaluing these guys, because I don't think their value is definitely not Tyreek's, but I don't think it's tied to Tua necessarily. I don't think they need to be these studs, So
no, it's more tied to the offense, to be honest, than it is just Tua. So, but it doesn't really matter because I think Tyreek's going to, finish out in Miami. So, no one else to talk about. I mean, we talked about all the free agents they have after that, and there's really no one else to really talk about on this entire team except for the tight end. I do think Julian Hill is an interesting stash as well. He's a tight end. He was a rookie last year. He played at Campbell, the Camels, which is it's a very low school. It's not one of the Power 5 conferences and stuff like that. So he was definitely a work in progress, but he was a receiving tight end there. He's very athletic, and learning Miami's system is quite complicated for tight ends. If you ever just watch San Francisco, Miami, their tight ends are moving all the time. So I think he kind of took this year to learn it. But if he takes the year to learn it and Durham Smythe is the other guy, he could easily replace him. And I think this team does want a third weapon in the passing game, besides the running back. So I think he's a decent stash, and just see if he, enters the year as the tight end 1 or 2. But that's all I really have to say about the tight ends. Unless you got something.
Nah, that's about it. I don't think there's much to say.
Yep. So we are done then. Julian Hill is not even ranked in Keep Trade Cut. It means he's not even in the top 77. That's kind of crazy. But yeah, he's definitely on waiver wires. I'd think about stashing him. But that is all. That was one of our longer ones, not quite beating the Titans yet. But so we will finish up there. We'll be back with the Philadelphia Eagles. What a disappointing year for them. As always, like and subscribe. We'll catch you guys next time.